Elena Brooks nearly dropped the heavy cast-iron skillet when the door of her small restaurant opened and a man with hair the precise color of frost under winter moonlight stepped inside, as though the dusty county road itself had delivered him. His skin held the pale stillness of someone who had stood too long beneath stars that never changed. He wore a simple dark coat that did not match the tired lines around his eyes, and when he looked at her, the room seemed to quiet in a way the usual farm customers never caused. The morning light coming through the front windows caught the white of his hair and turned it luminous rather than cold. Elena had seen many strangers pass through Willowmere over the years, salesmen and travelers, and the occasional tourist who had taken a wrong turn, but none of them had carried that particular gravity. "I was told the food here could make a man remember who he used to be," he said. His voice carried the calm weight of someone who had spoken to boards and kings and no longer needed volume to be heard. Elena set the skillet down carefully. Flour dusted one wrist. Heat from the old range still clung to her forehead. "Found the right place. Sit by the window. There is no menu at noon. You take what the farm sent this morning." He did as she said. The table by the window looked out over the quiet street of Willowmere, Indiana, where maples leaned over the narrow road, and the feed store still kept its wooden bench in constant need of repair. Cassian Voss had left Chicago before dawn without telling the council or his children. His phone lay silent in the car, the calls from directors and attorneys already stacking like unpaid debts. He had money enough to erase almost any inconvenience and power older than the city itself, yet he could not remember the last time rest had found him. The drive north had taken most of the morning. Office towers had given way to cornfields and low wooded ridges, and by the time the pavement turned to pale dust, he had begun to feel the first fragile edge of something that might have been relief. Elena brought the plate herself. Pot roast, green beans still bright from the garden, mashed potatoes, skillet bread, and a square of apple cobbler that smelled of cinnamon and patience. Cassian took one bite and stopped. The seasoning was simple, yet the taste carried him backward across decades to a farm kitchen where chairs never matched and no one checked a ledger between sentences. He had forgotten that food could make a man remember the mortal he had once pretended to be before ambition and eternity chose every path for him. The memory was so sharp that for a moment he sat very still, the fork resting against the edge of the plate. "Too much salt?" Elena asked from behind the counter. "No," he answered. "It tastes like somewhere I should have returned to a long time ago." She did not press. That restraint moved him more than sympathy ever could. After the meal, he ordered coffee simply to remain. They spoke of late rains, of farmers worried over soybeans, of the school fundraiser, and of old Henry, who refused to replace the bench he kept mending with the same stubborn hands. Cassian said only that he worked in business and had needed a day away. He did not mention the buildings that carried his name in quiet ways, the companies that moved according to his decisions, or the ancient blood that made him vampire king of a line that stretched farther than any map. Elena never asked. She refilled his cup once without being prompted and leaned against the opposite side of the counter, while the conversation drifted from weather to the way the maple leaves had begun to turn earlier than usual that year. When he paid, he left far more cash than the bill required. She pushed most of it back across the wooden counter. "You paid for lunch," she said. "You do not need to pay for being treated like a person." The sentence followed him all the way to the expensive car he had parked out of sight. Before leaving, he turned at the porch steps. "Will you be open tomorrow?" Elena glanced toward the kitchen, where a pot already simmered for the next day. "Unless the roof blows off tonight." For the first time in years, Cassian drove back toward the city, wishing the road stretched longer in the opposite direction. As Willowmere disappeared in the mirror, he realized he had spent an entire afternoon without being introduced by title or bloodline. No one had asked what he owned. No one had tried to impress him. The relief was so unfamiliar that it frightened him almost as much as it comforted him. He drove in silence for a long while, the fields sliding past in shades of green and gold, and understood that something inside him had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by simply returning to the routines that had once defined him. That night, his house in the city felt larger than usual. The dining table could seat a crowd, yet only one place had been set. Staff had left a meal under silver covers that he never touched. He stood in the doorway, remembered Elena's skillet bread, and lost whatever appetite the centuries had left him. He carried a cup of coffee into the living room. The machine built into the wall produced something perfectly consistent. He hated it. His oldest son, Marcus, called about an acquisition that threatened the human front of their holdings. His daughter called about papers. His youngest wanted him to speak with a banker who had grown nervous. Cassian answered none of them. Instead, he sat in the dark and thought of a woman who had pushed money back because she believed a meal had an honest price and kindness did not. Before sunrise, he was already dressed. At the headquarters of the Voss Holdings, his executive assistant, Isabel Grant, followed him into the office with a schedule packed from morning to evening. She had worked beside him long enough to recognize when his silence turned dangerous. "The council is waiting downstairs," she said. Then the lender call, lunch with the governor's team, and the investor meeting. Cassian looked through the glass wall at the city waking beneath him. "Cancel the week." Isabel stared. "The week. All of it. You have never done that. Then we have discovered something new about me." He left before anyone could build an argument strong enough to stop him. By late morning, the blue-trimmed restaurant stood ahead of him again. Elena was carrying dishes from a table when he entered. Her surprise lasted only a moment. "You came back. I was warned about becoming dependent on the food. I do not remember warning you. You should have." She laughed and pointed toward the same table by the window. After the last farmhands left, Cassian noticed her stacking plates beside the deep sink. He removed his coat and asked whether she needed help. She looked at his pressed shirt and the shoes that still carried the city on them. "You? I have washed dishes before." "When?" He considered the question. "Long enough ago that I may require supervision." Elena handed him an apron. For the next hour, Cassian scrubbed plates while she dried them. He was clumsy at first, splashing water onto his sleeves and nearly dropping a heavy skillet. Elena teased him without cruelty. He found himself laughing in a way that made the old muscles of his face ache. Their conversation moved beyond weather and food. Elena explained that the restaurant had belonged to her parents. Her father had built the back room with friends from neighboring farms. Her mother had taught her every recipe without ever writing one down. Both had died within a relatively short span, leaving Elena with the building, a garden behind it, and a responsibility she considered more precious than any deed. "People think I stay because I am afraid to leave," she said. "I stay because this place still gives something useful to people." Cassian looked at her hands, worn from honest work. His first instinct was to offer repairs, new equipment, staff, anything his wealth or influence could solve. He stopped himself. Elena did not speak like someone waiting to be rescued. Near sunset, she served slices of cornmeal cake on the porch. Cassian told her he was a widower and that his children were grown. He admitted he had spent much of his long life working and had recently begun wondering what all that work was supposed to have been for. "You sound lonely," Elena said. The directness surprised him. "I suppose I am. Loneliness gets worse when we keep decorating it instead of admitting it is there." Cassian smiled the small, rare smile that had not appeared in decades. "You do not waste words. I have dishes to wash." He laughed again, then glanced toward the road. The thought of returning to the mansion made something inside him tighten. "Is there a place around here where a traveler could stay for a few days?" Elena studied him. "Agnes Cole rents out a guest room. She lives near the old grain elevator. Clean house, better breakfast than any motel." An hour later, Agnes, a small silver-haired widow with bright eyes, showed Cassian into a modest room with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window facing a vegetable patch. She never asked why a man with an expensive car wanted such simple lodging. Cassian set his watch in a drawer, turned off the corporate phone, and lay down listening to crickets beyond the screen. He slept more deeply than he had in years. In the morning, Agnes poured coffee at a round kitchen table and placed orange bread beside his plate. Cassian looked around at family photographs, chipped mugs, and curtains moving in the breeze. Nothing matched, yet everything belonged. When he walked back toward Elena's table, he left his car at Agnes's house. For once, he wanted to arrive without anything announcing his importance before he had spoken. Elena was sweeping the porch when Cassian appeared on foot. She leaned on the broom and glanced past him toward the street. "Close your car?" "No, I thought walking might improve my character. That could take a while." He smiled. "Then I should start early." She gave him coffee, and before long he was carrying split firewood from the shed behind the restaurant. Elena still cooked partly on an old cast-iron range that her father had refused to replace. Cassian's hands, softened by centuries of offices and steering wheels, reddened quickly. He kept working anyway. By midday, soot marked his shirt and a shallow scrape crossed one knuckle. Elena handed him a glass of cold water. "You know, you do not have to prove anything here. That may be exactly why I want to help." The answer made her quiet. Days settled into a rhythm Cassian had never planned. He ate breakfast with Agnes, walked to Elena's table, lifted boxes, repaired a loose porch rail, washed pans, or drove with Elena to buy produce from nearby farms. He told Isabel by message that he was unavailable except for genuine emergencies. He told his children even less. The people of Willowmere accepted him gradually. Old Henry began saving him a place on the bench in the square. Theo Hale, a mechanic whose shop stood near the river, taught him how to patch a garden cart tire instead of replacing the whole wheel. Ruth Ellis, a retired schoolteacher who ate soup at Elena's twice a week, watched Cassian carry flour sacks and declared that he was finally developing useful skills. Nobody treated him as a powerful man because nobody knew he was one. That anonymity felt like mercy. One afternoon, Elena asked him to ride with her to a farm 3 miles outside town. The road was gravel and the sky held the soft gray of late summer. They spoke little on the way, but the silence felt companionable rather than empty. At the farm, a woman named Patricia handed them baskets of late tomatoes and green beans still cool from the morning picking. Cassian carried the heavier loads without being asked. On the drive back, Elena glanced at him once and said, "You do not have to earn your keep every hour." "I know," he answered, "but it feels better than sitting still." She nodded as if she understood more than he had said. That evening he stayed after closing and helped her wipe down the last tables. Their hands moved in the same quiet rhythm, and for a moment old Cassian forgot the centuries that had taught him to measure every gesture for advantage. The next day, Theo appeared at the restaurant with a broken garden cart and a challenge. "If you are going to keep hanging around, you might as well learn something useful." Cassian spent 2 hours under the shade of a maple, learning how to seat a tire properly without the tools he would have ordered from a specialist in the city. His hands grew dirty. Theo laughed when the first attempt failed and clapped him on the shoulder when the second held. Elena watched from the doorway and said nothing, but the small smile she wore stayed with Cassian longer than any formal praise he had received in boardrooms. Ruth Ellis invited him to sit with her during the slow mid-afternoon. She asked no questions about his past. Instead, she told him stories of the town when the grain elevator still ran full and the train stopped twice a day. Cassian listened and realized he had not simply been hearing people for years. He had been calculating them. Here the calculation had no place. Old Henry joined them once and argued mildly about the best way to keep a wooden bench from warping. Cassian offered to sand it himself. Henry accepted with the grave dignity of a man who trusted work more than promises. On Friday evening, after the last customers left, Elena brewed lemon balm tea. She and Cassian sat on the porch while the sky turned amber over the fields. Elena studied his hands. "Those do not belong to the same man who arrived here." Cassian looked at the new calluses. Maybe they should have. She was silent for a while, then asked, "What are you running from?" He could have answered with a joke. Instead, something in her face made dishonesty feel cheap. "My wife died after a short illness," he said. "I did not know how to live in the house without her, so I worked. I worked during breakfast. I worked at night. I worked when my children needed me. I told myself I was protecting their future. The truth is that work was easier than grief. By the time I understood the difference, they had learned not to expect me." His voice broke slightly. He stared at the road. "I bought them everything I could not give them as a father." Elena rested her hand lightly on his forearm. "Regret hurts because some part of us still knows what should have mattered." Cassian swallowed hard. "My parents died before I was ready too," she continued. "I spent months angry at every ordinary morning that arrived without them. Then I understood that grief is love with nowhere obvious to go. So I put mine into this place." Cassian turned toward her. For the first time since his wife's funeral, he cried in front of another person. Elena did not tell him to stop or reassure him with easy promises. She simply stayed. Dark clouds gathered while they talked. Soon rain began striking the porch roof. Wind pushed water across the street, and they hurried inside to secure the windows and move flower pots away from the edge. The storm intensified until the restaurant seemed cut off from the rest of Indiana. A lamp glowed on the counter after the power flickered out. The old stove held a low orange fire. Elena brought Cassian a towel. Their hands met. Neither moved away. The room was quiet except for the rain. Cassian looked at her, and she looked back with a tenderness that frightened him because it was not admiration, gratitude, or curiosity. It was personal. He felt himself lean closer. Then thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the window panes. Elena startled and stepped back. They both laughed nervously, but the moment had already changed. Cassian walked to the window. He had nearly kissed a woman who knew his grief, his loneliness, and his failures, but not the central fact of his present life. She believed he was simply a tired businessman taking time away. She did not know the scale of his fortune or the public name attached to it, nor the older truth that blood older than the town itself ran in his veins. For the first time, his silence felt less like privacy and more like deception. The next morning, he woke before Agnes and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. He decided he would tell Elena everything before another day passed. If what was growing between them was real, it had to survive the truth. Cassian reached Elena's table early enough that the chairs were still upside down on several tables. Overnight rain had rinsed the dust from the street, and sunlight shone on puddles beside the curb. Elena was inside arranging jars of preserves near the register when she saw him. A trace of the previous night's almost kiss passed between them. "I need to tell you something," Cassian said. Elena set down a jar. "That sounds serious." "It is." They sat at the table by the window where he had eaten his first meal. Cassian placed both hands flat on the cloth, searching for a beginning that did not sound like an excuse. "My name is Cassian Voss," he said slowly, "and I have not told you the whole truth about what I do." Before he could continue, the sound of a large engine rolled down the street. Cassian's stomach dropped. A black sport utility vehicle stopped outside. Marcus stepped out first, dressed as though he had come directly from a boardroom. Isabel followed with a leather portfolio pressed against her side. Marcus entered without noticing the expression on his father's face. "There you are," he said. "Do you have any idea what you have put everyone through?" Elena turned toward Cassian. Marcus kept going. "The head of the Voss Holdings cannot disappear for days while lenders are calling and the council is panicking. We had to trace your vehicle just to find you." Elena did not speak. Isabel saw the situation immediately. "Mr. Voss," she said carefully, "I am sorry, we have an emergency. There are contracts that cannot wait." Marcus looked around the restaurant, irritation sharpening his voice. "You have been hiding here." Cassian stood. "Enough," he said. The authority in his tone was instant and unmistakable. Marcus fell silent. Elena watched Cassian as though a second person had stepped out from behind the man she knew. "Go outside," Cassian told them. "Both of you. Give me a few minutes." Marcus started to argue, but Isabel touched his arm and guided him toward the door. When they were gone, Cassian turned back. Elena had moved behind the counter. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I know. You were sitting right there. I should have told you sooner." "Yes." He approached the counter, but stopped before reaching it. "I did not come here to make fun of anyone. I was tired of being treated differently because of my money and the name that comes with it. The first day you spoke to me like I was simply hungry. I wanted to know what that felt like for a little longer." Elena folded a dish towel with slow, precise movements. "So you decided what I was allowed to know. I was afraid the truth would change things. It has. I never lied about my wife or my children or how lost I felt." "No," Elena said. "You only left out the part that changed the meaning of everything else." Her voice remained calm, which hurt more than anger. "You came into my kitchen. You listened while I talked about my parents. You let me believe you were a man trying to figure out an ordinary life. All the while you could return to a company, a mansion, and people searching for you. I did not think your life was ordinary. That is not the point." She finally looked at him. "Do you know what makes this painful? Not that you are rich. I do not care how many buildings carry your name. It is that you wanted the freedom to test whether I would care about you, without giving me the freedom to decide how I felt about the real you." Cassian had negotiated with hostile boards and government regulators. He had survived lawsuits and market collapses, and older, darker challenges that never reached the newspapers. He had no defense against that sentence. "I am sorry. I believe you are. I care about you. I believe that too." Hope rose for half a second. Then she continued, "But caring does not repair trust the moment it is broken." Outside, Marcus paced beside the vehicle. Isabel stood near the hood, pretending not to watch the door. Cassian said he had to return to the city because thousands of employees and more ancient obligations depended on decisions he had abandoned. He promised he would come back when the crisis was handled. Elena did not ask him to stay. "The restaurant is open to anyone who comes honestly," she said. "If you return, do not bring another version of yourself." Cassian nodded, unable to trust his voice. He walked outside and got into the vehicle. During the drive south, Marcus began explaining falling share prices and frightened investors. Cassian raised a hand. "Not yet." He watched wet fields slide past the window. In less than an hour, he would be the public face of the holdings again. Problems worth millions would become urgent. None of it felt as urgent as the expression Elena had worn when she realized he had not trusted her with the truth. For the first time in his long career, Cassian understood that a secret could be expensive even when it protected money and bloodline. This one had cost him the only place where he had felt known. The crisis at the Voss holdings was real, but it was not impossible. Cassian spent the next several days doing what he had always done best. He called lenders before they called him. He calmed investors, negotiated new terms, replaced a failing strategy, and forced several directors to make decisions they had been postponing. By the end of the week, the company had stabilized. Everyone congratulated him. Cassian felt nothing. He returned each night to the same quiet house, removed his suit, and wandered through rooms designed by people who had never asked how a lonely man might live inside them. He opened the refrigerator once and found labeled containers prepared by staff. He closed it and remembered Elena handing a tired farm worker an extra biscuit without adding it to the bill. The silence of the mansion pressed against him in ways the quiet of Willowmere never had. In the city, the quiet was empty. In the small town, it had been full of crickets and distant engines, and the low murmur of people who still spoke to one another without checking their phones. Cassian stood at the tall windows of his study and watched the lights of the city and felt no claim on any of them. He thought of the apron Elena had handed him and the way the water had soaked his sleeves. He thought of the cornmeal cake on the porch and the way her hand had rested on his forearm when he spoke of his wife. Those memories did not fade under the weight of the crisis. They grew sharper. One night, Marcus came to the house. "You saved the company," his son said. "The board wants you back full-time. They think the disappearance was exhaustion. Maybe it was clarity." Marcus frowned. "About what?" Cassian looked at the son he had raised mostly through money and careful distance. Beneath the expensive suit, he saw something that had taken him too long to notice. Marcus was not only ambitious, he was afraid. Cassian had built a family where security meant assets and affection often arrived as problem-solving. Marcus had learned the language his father had taught him. "I owe you an apology," Cassian said. Marcus looked almost offended. For leaving during a crisis. For leaving long before that. They sat in the formal living room that neither of them had ever found comfortable. Cassian spoke of the years he had measured love by the size of the solutions he provided. Marcus listened with the stiff posture of a man who had spent a lifetime preparing defenses. The conversation did not heal them. It was too late for one evening to repair decades, but it was the first time Cassian spoke to his son without discussing business. When Marcus finally left, he paused at the door and said, "I do not understand what you are doing, but I heard you." The next morning, Cassian called his 3 children and the board into the same conference room. Isabel sat near the wall, expression unreadable. Cassian entered without a tie. "I am stepping back," he said. Several people assumed he meant temporarily. He corrected them. He explained that control of the human holdings would pass to the leadership team and over time to his children if they wanted the responsibility. He would keep enough to live securely, but a large portion of his personal holdings would be transferred into foundations supporting rural health clinics, food programs, and scholarships in communities that rarely appeared in the presentations shown to investors. Marcus stood. "This is because of that woman." Cassian met his eyes. "No, she did not ask me for a cent. That is one reason I finally listened to myself. You are throwing away everything you built. I am changing what it is for." His daughter, who had remained silent, asked, "And what happens to us?" The question pierced him. "You are adults. You will still have more than enough. But I hope what happens to us is that someday you call me because you want to have dinner." No one answered. Cassian signed the first papers that afternoon. Over the following weeks, he sold the mansion, resigned from boards, ended memberships he had barely used, and gave away more possessions than he packed. He kept photographs of his wife, several books, a worn pocket knife that had belonged to his father, and one old ceramic mug his children had painted when they were small. The process of letting go proved slower and more deliberate than any acquisition he had ever managed. Each item he released carried a small weight he had not noticed while it still belonged to him. Theo in Willowmere helped him locate a modest property outside town, a weathered farmhouse, a neglected garden, a shed leaning slightly east, and several acres that had not been worked well in years. Cassian bought it without negotiating aggressively for the price. He also bought an old pickup. When Isabel saw the vehicle, she laughed for the first time in Cassian's presence. "You know the door sticks, so I have been told, and the heater barely works. I have owned companies with worse problems." Before he left the city, Isabel handed him a small folder. "No contracts," she said. "Just forwarding information and the number of someone who can reach you if there is a true emergency." Cassian thanked her. Then she added, "For what it is worth, I think you looked less tired when I found you in that restaurant." Cassian nodded. "I was. Meanwhile, Elena continued opening before sunrise and closing after the last coffee cup was washed. She told no one the details of what had happened. Agnes knew enough to keep her questions gentle. Ruth tried once to mention Cassian and stopped when Elena's face changed. The empty chair by the window became difficult to ignore. Elena missed the man who had carried wood, listened to stories about her parents, and cried without shame on the porch. She also resented that some of those memories now contained a hidden room she had never been allowed to enter. Months passed. The weather cooled. Harvest trucks moved along the highways. Leaves gathered in the gutters beside Elena's porch. Then on a mild morning, she heard an old engine coughing outside. She wiped her hands and walked to the door. A faded pickup stood at the curb. Cassian climbed out wearing jeans, a plain work shirt, and scuffed boots. He looked smaller without the armor of wealth, but somehow more certain. Elena's heart recognized him before her pride could decide what to do. Cassian stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and did not come closer. "I should have called," he said. Elena crossed her arms. "You should have done several things. I know." She looked at the pickup, then at him. "Where is the chairman?" "Retired." The answer sounded too simple, and Elena's expression showed it. Cassian removed his cap. "I left the company. I sold the house. I kept enough to live on, and I moved the rest of what I could into charitable work. I bought a small farm outside town." Elena stared at him. "Why?" "Because I spent years believing my life had to remain the same just because I had worked hard to build it. Then I came here and discovered that being successful and being alive were not the same thing." She did not soften immediately. "And you expect me to believe you changed your entire life for me?" "No." Cassian shook his head. "I changed it because I finally understood what I had become. I came back because I hope eventually you might allow me to know you again." Elena looked beyond him toward the maple trees. "What if I do not? Then I will still live honestly, and I will still be sorry." That answer reached her more deeply than any declaration of love could have. She stepped aside and pointed toward a chair on the porch. "You can have coffee." Cassian exhaled as though he had been granted much more. Elena brought out 2 cups. They sat with space between them. The maple leaves above them shifted in a light breeze, and somewhere down the street a dog barked once and fell silent again. "Trust is not a door," she said. "It does not swing open because somebody knocks politely." "I understand." "No, you understand the sentence. We will see whether you understand the work." Cassian looked at the cup in his hands. The coffee was strong and simple, the way she always made it. He remembered the first cup she had poured him months earlier, and how he had stayed longer than the drink required. "I will not ask for more than you are ready to give," he said. "If that means only coffee and quiet for a while, then that is what I will take." Elena studied him over the rim of her own cup. "You used to speak like a man who expected the world to rearrange itself around his decisions." "I did. It was a habit that cost more than I knew." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched a pair of children ride bicycles past the square, their laughter carrying on the mild air. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "People in this town do not forget easily. They also do not hold grudges the way cities do. They watch, they wait, they decide slowly." "Then I will give them time," Cassian said. "And you?" Cassian nodded. He did not ask for forgiveness again that day. Instead, he began rebuilding his life in visible, ordinary ways. Theo taught him how to repair a fence without making it worse. Old Henry showed him which part of the low field stayed wet after heavy rain. A young farmer named Mason Reed helped him choose seed for a small vegetable plot and laughed when Cassian arrived with gloves too clean to be taken seriously. Cassian accepted every joke. His first rows were crooked. Rabbits ate part of his lettuce. A water line broke during a cold morning and soaked his boots. He learned that land did not care about resumes, confidence, or the ability to dominate a meeting. It answered only to patience, weather, effort, and luck. Elena watched from a distance. Cassian came to the restaurant occasionally, always as a customer unless she asked for help. He paid the exact bill. He did not leave oversized tips. He did not offer to replace her old stove or buy the building. When a refrigerator finally failed, Elena mentioned it in frustration. Cassian listened and asked, "Do you want advice, help moving one, or just someone to agree that machines are terrible?" She laughed despite herself. "Help moving one." So Cassian and Theo carried a used replacement through the back door while Elena directed them. That evening, she gave them both dinner. The weeks that followed taught Cassian more about silence than any boardroom ever had. He rose early and walked the perimeter of his small fields while the mist still clung to the low ground. He learned the difference between soil that would hold water and soil that would starve the roots. When Mason stopped by with advice, Cassian listened without interrupting. When Theo brought spare tools, Cassian thanked him by helping with a stubborn engine later the same afternoon. The work left him tired in a way the centuries of strategy never had. It was a clean tiredness that ended when the sun went down and left no residual calculation behind. Elena noticed the change without commenting on it at first. One afternoon, she found him on her porch steps with a small basket of early greens. "These are crooked," she said, examining a lettuce leaf. "I know," Cassian answered, "but they are honest." She took the basket inside and returned with 2 glasses of iced tea. They sat without speaking for a long while. The silence between them had grown comfortable, the kind that did not demand filling. Cassian watched a pair of sparrows argue over a crumb near the steps and felt the old urgency to control something, anything, drain slowly out of him. Weeks turned into months. Cassian began selling vegetables at the Saturday market. He was not a remarkable farmer, but he was improving. He donated extra produce to the church pantry without putting his name on anything. Ruth caught him doing it and warned that small towns had poor respect for secrecy. Cassian only smiled and said that secrecy had already cost him enough. Ruth patted his arm and told him the town had decided he was staying, whether he liked it or not. One afternoon, his daughter arrived from the city. She found her father fixing a loose hinge on Elena's porch. Cassian froze, unsure whether she had come to drag him back or judge the life he had chosen. She looked at his muddy boots. "You really live here now?" "I do." She glanced at Elena, who remained near the doorway. "I wanted to see the place." Elena invited her inside. Over pie, the daughter confessed that she had been angry at her father for years, not because he had denied her anything, but because every family problem had been answered with money instead of presents. Cassian listened without defending himself. The pie was still warm. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and the faint sweetness of the fruit Elena had put up the previous autumn. His daughter spoke carefully at first, as if testing the strength of the new ground between them. Then the carefulness fell away, and she told him of the years she had waited for a conversation that never arrived, because every visit had been scheduled around meetings, and every gift had arrived with a card written by an assistant. "I thought providing was the same as loving well," he said. "It was part of it," she replied, "just not all of it." They sat for a long time after the pie was gone. Elena moved quietly in the background, giving them space without leaving the room entirely. When his daughter rose to leave, she hugged him. It was awkward and brief, but Cassian stood on the porch afterward with tears in his eyes. Elena joined him. "You did not try to explain yourself," she said. "I have explained myself for most of my life. And now I am trying to listen before there is nobody left speaking." Elena touched his hand only for a moment, but this time she was the one who reached first. Cassian did not turn that touch into a promise. He simply stood beside her while afternoon light moved across the porch boards. Months earlier, he would have tried to secure the moment, define it, and make sure it belonged to him. Now he understood that some things grow only when they are not forced. The weight of her fingers against his remained after she withdrew them, a quiet reminder that trust returned in small measures rather than sudden declarations. By spring, Cassian's farm no longer looked abandoned. The fence stood straight. The garden held neat rows of greens and tomatoes, and the shed roof no longer leaked. His hands carried permanent calluses now, and the people around Willowmere had stopped treating his mistakes as entertainment. Elena had changed too, though more quietly. She no longer watched him for signs that he might suddenly disappear. When the lunch crowd became heavy, she sometimes called from the kitchen, "Cassian, if you are going to stand there drinking coffee, make yourself useful." He always did. One Saturday, a fierce windstorm crossed the county. It did not destroy the restaurant, but it tore part of the porch awning loose and sent a branch through a section of the roof above the storage room. Rain damaged flour, boxes of dry goods, and several old shelves built by Elena's father. Cassian arrived before sunrise after Agnes called him. He found Elena standing in the storage room staring at water dripping into a bucket. The air smelled of wet wood and spoiled grain. Her shoulders were set in the way they became when she was determined not to let anyone see how much the damage cost her. "I can pay for all of this," he said, then immediately stopped. Elena raised an eyebrow. Cassian corrected himself. That was the old answer. "What is the new one? What do you want to do?" She looked around. "I want to repair it. I just do not know how fast I can manage." "Then we repair it," Cassian called Theo. Not a contractor from the city. Theo called Mason. Ruth organized meals for volunteers. Old Henry appeared with a toolbox that looked older than Cassian. By mid-morning, neighbors were carrying ruined supplies outside and measuring boards. Cassian worked beside everyone else, lifting lumber and pulling wet insulation. He paid for nothing Elena had not agreed to. The work was slow and physical. Sweat darkened his shirt. Splinters found their way into his palms. He accepted both without complaint. At lunch, she stood in the damaged dining room and looked at the people eating sandwiches on mismatched chairs. My father used to say a restaurant is not a building, she said. It is the people who show up hungry. Old Henry nodded toward the roof. Today we showed up with hammers. Elena laughed, and Cassian realized he had not heard that full unguarded laugh since before his secret had been exposed. The sound settled into him like a promise he had not known he was waiting for. The repairs took several days. During that time, Marcus came to town. Unlike his sister, he arrived with suspicion. He walked through Cassian's small farmhouse, looked at the simple furniture and muddy boots near the back door, and asked, "How long are you planning to keep proving a point?" Cassian placed 2 mugs on the kitchen table. "I am not proving a point. You gave away control of your life's work. I handed responsibility to people who said they wanted it. You embarrassed the family." Cassian sat across from him. "I embarrassed you. I am sorry for that. But I am not sorry I left." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Was I such a terrible son?" Cassian felt the question beneath the anger. "No," he said. "I was a father who taught you that worth came from winning. Then I blamed you for becoming competitive. That was unfair." Marcus looked away. They spoke for a long time. Nothing was solved neatly. Marcus still believed Cassian had acted recklessly. Cassian still believed leaving had saved him. But when Marcus finally stood to go, he accepted a bag of vegetables from the garden. "Your sister says your tomatoes are good. She lies when she wants peace." Marcus almost smiled. That evening, Cassian went to Elena's table. The repaired porch smelled of new pine. Elena sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "Your son came, he did. How did it go?" "We disagreed honestly. That is better than agreeing dishonestly." Cassian looked at her. "You have a phrase for everything." "Occupational hazard." The sun lowered behind the trees. Cassian reached toward her hand, but stopped before touching it. Elena noticed. Months earlier, he would have acted on what he wanted and explained afterward. Now he waited. She placed her hand in his. "I forgive you," she said. Cassian's throat tightened. "You do not have to say that because I changed my life. I am not. I am saying it because you stopped trying to purchase the result." He closed his fingers gently around hers. "I loved you before I knew the truth," Elena continued. "Then I hated that I still loved you after I learned it. I needed time to find out whether the man I loved was real." A small smile appeared. "He is real. He was just buried under too many things." Cassian laughed softly, then grew serious. "May I kiss you?" Elena's smile widened. "Yes." There was no storm this time, no thunder, no interruption. Their kiss was brief and tender, carrying none of the urgency of people trying to recover lost youth. It felt instead like 2 mature lives, choosing carefully and consciously to walk in the same direction. From across the street, old Henry pretended to study the repaired bench. Elena pulled back and whispered, "Half the town knows already." Cassian looked toward the square. "For once," he said, "I do not mind being public." A year after Cassian returned to Willowmere, in the faded pickup, the restaurant porch was crowded with people carrying covered dishes and folding chairs. Elena had closed early, something she almost never did. Agnes arranged wildflowers in jars. Ruth complained that Henry had placed the chairs crooked. Theo insisted they were crooked because the porch itself was crooked. Cassian stood near the blue-trimmed doorway, wearing a plain dark suit. He owned only a few suits now, and none felt like armor. Elena came out wearing a simple cream dress. There was no ballroom, no orchestra, and no guest list filled with people who knew Cassian only from business pages. His 3 children were there. His daughter held a small bouquet from Cassian's garden. His youngest had driven in that morning. Marcus stood beside Henry, still looking slightly uncomfortable, in a town where everyone called his father Cassian and nobody cared what the family company was worth. They exchanged vows beneath the old maple near the square. Cassian promised no impossible future. He promised truth, presence, and the courage to speak before silence became a wall. Elena promised patience without pretending patience meant accepting anything. When they kissed, the people who had watched their difficult second beginning applauded louder than either expected. Afterward, Elena served supper in the restaurant. Cassian carried plates. Nobody allowed him to escape the dishwashing. The room filled with the low talk of neighbors, who had come not for spectacle, but for the simple pleasure of witnessing 2 people who had earned their way back to each other. Old Henry raised a glass of lemonade and made a short toast that made everyone laugh. Theo claimed the last piece of pie and declared that the roof would hold for another 50 years if they kept the same crew. Ruth wiped her eyes once when she thought no one was looking. Marcus stood a little apart at first, then gradually moved closer until he was helping clear tables with the same careful efficiency he had once reserved for boardrooms. Later, when the room had emptied and the last chair was returned to its place, Cassian and Elena sat on the porch with coffee. The repaired bench across the street shone beneath a street lamp. Somewhere beyond town, his small fields rested under the dark. The coffee had gone cold, but neither of them moved. Cassian thought about the afternoon he had arrived in an expensive car, hungry and exhausted, believing he needed only an escape from work. He understood now that he had been hungry for something far more difficult to name. Age had taught him lessons success never managed to teach. For much of his life, he had believed time was a resource to manage. He had divided days into meetings, flights, reports, and decisions, always assuming the people he loved would remain available when his calendar finally became generous. But time had never signed that agreement. His wife had died before he was ready. His children had grown while he was busy providing for the adults he imagined they would become. Even his own face had changed while he was looking at spreadsheets instead of mirrors. He had also mistaken usefulness for love. Solving problems made him feel necessary, and being necessary protected him from the frightening work of being emotionally present. Money could pay tuition, buy houses, hire help, and remove many forms of hardship. Those were real gifts, and Cassian did not despise them. What money could not do was sit beside a grieving child and remain quiet. It could not apologize with humility. It could not make a neglected relationship healthy simply because the bills had been paid on time. Elena had taught him something equally difficult. Simplicity was not the same as innocence, weakness, or poverty. A person who lived with less could still possess boundaries stronger than any locked gate. Her refusal to forgive him immediately had been an act of dignity. If she had accepted his apology merely because he changed his clothes and gave away money, he might never have understood what trust required. Trust returned because he showed up repeatedly with nothing hidden in his hands. Cassian no longer believed that becoming older meant becoming fixed. People carried history, habits, pride, and mistakes into later life. But none of those things had to become a prison. Change was not proven by a dramatic promise. It was proven on ordinary mornings. By listening when defending oneself would be easier. By calling a son without needing anything. By washing a pan because someone else was tired. By telling the truth even when the truth might cost affection. He had once thought wealth meant having enough that he never needed anyone. Now he saw how lonely that definition had been. The richest years of his life began when he learned to need people without trying to own their choices, and to help them without making help a form of control. The years that followed would not be free of difficulty. There would be days when the old habits of distance tried to reassert themselves, and days when Elena's quiet firmness would remind him that love required presence more than protection. There would be seasons when the farm demanded more than he expected, and seasons when the restaurant needed extra hands. They would face those seasons together, not as a king and a subject, but as two people who had chosen to build something that could not be measured in ledgers or bloodlines. Cassian had spent centuries believing that power was the only reliable shelter. Elena had shown him that shelter could also be a porch light left on, a cup of coffee poured without asking, and the simple knowledge that someone would notice if he did not come home. Elena rested her head against his shoulder. Cassian looked through the window at the table where she had first served him lunch. It was still plain wood beneath the checked cloth. Nothing about it would have impressed the man he used to be. That was precisely why he loved it. He finally understood that a good life was not measured by how much a person managed to keep. It was measured by what remained in the heart after titles, possessions, applause, and fear had been stripped away. For Cassian, what remained was the quiet certainty that he had found a place where he could be known without being useful, and a woman who had taught him that honesty was the only currency that never lost its value. In the end, that was enough. It had always been enough. He had simply needed a long time and a great deal of silence to learn it.